Welcome back, everyone. In the past few videos, we've learned about how to authenticate and also get the user object from Firebase. We've learned how to sync it up with our front-end application by creating these sign-in and sign-up forms. And primarily now that we have the user and we have a way to authenticate them, let's discuss how to actually leverage that user object that we're getting back inside of our application and think on a higher level about what to do with said user. Now, before we talk about that, let's go back to our terminal and let's just commit our code. So I'm going to say that what we've done and what we have to commit up is that we created authentication page component alongside our sign in form. So let's push that up and then let's discuss what we need and why we need to store this user. So in order for us to better understand what it is that we want to do with this user object we get from our sign-in, let's think a little bit about our components inside of React. Imagine that this is your component tree. Up at the top, you have your application. Down lower in one level, we know that we have our auth page, and our auth page is a child of our top level app component. We know this because auth is nested in a route nested inside of our entire application component. Similarly, auth has two routes, both sign in and sign up. Now imagine, for example, we had two other routes that were also children of the app, but they were siblings of auth. Imagine on the left, we had some kind of settings page. On the settings page, imagine we had a user page, and within the user, maybe we have some profile page. Similarly, on the right side, imagine we had this orders page, which kept track of your orders history, but also the returns that that user might have made. So here you can imagine that for these routes on the left and the right, the settings and the orders, that both of these need access to this user object that you get from your sign-in and your sign-up. So here, the key thing to remember is that based on what we've built so far, we know that when we get that auth user object, we either get it in the sign in or we get it in the sign up. These are the two places that we directly get from Firebase the actual user auth object. From here, though, we can imagine how on this left settings side, that profile needs that user object. Because how else are you going to know what the actual profile of this user is? Maybe on the profile page is how you update display name or you change the email. But the key thing here is that this profile needs access to the data that we got from sign in and sign up. Similarly, you can imagine how on the right side, maybe there's orders and returns and history. And in order for you to know what users' returns or history you have access to, you specifically also need the actual user object. So here you can see that what's the history of the orders for which user? Well, we only know that if we pass to our backend that gives us the order history, the user itself. We can see the same thing might be true for returns. So how would we actually be able to surface up this user data that lives in the sign-in? Well, what we would have to do is we would have to figure out which of these components is the top level common parent denominator. So if you look at this, at what point is there going to be some node that can access data and then distribute it out to the corresponding profile, returns, and history? Well, that would be the app component, because the app component is the highest level parent that can then in turn actually pass these props down to the corresponding correct children. Sign-in can't pass it directly to profile or returns or history. The reason for this is because, as we've seen with components, we can pass props down into children. In turn, we can find certain ways where we pass callbacks from a parent down to a child so that we can get the data up to the parent. Both ways are pretty cumbersome and pretty tied together, but it can be done. So here you can imagine that by using a similar pattern, we can pass the sign-in user data up one level before going back up to the app. Then, in order to give it to the profile, we'll have to go over to that settings page, and then from the settings component, pass it to its corresponding user child. And then finally, from user, we can finally pass it to the profile. Similarly, on the right side from app, again, at the top level, we pass it over to our orders. And then from orders, we pass it to returns. And similarly, from the orders, we pass it to the history. So here we could see this is a pattern where we'd be able to sign in and get the user data at the sign in and sign up, pass it all the way up to the app, but then pass it to the profile and pass it to the returns through all of the corresponding parents and children all the way down to those components that need them. But here, I hope you notice a problem. All of these orange nodes do not need the user data. All they serve to do is act as a traffic nodule almost. It's just a path that we have to pass user data through in order to get to the profile. And the way we pass it is we pass it through props. This is actually something known as prop drilling, because in order for you to drill the relevant data down a stream of children to the correct node component that actually needs it, you have to write all these props for all these intermediary components that don't even need that data in the first place. For example, app doesn't need user data. Neither does any of the settings nor the user component. Only the profile component on the left needs it. So here, it just makes no sense. You can see how profile returns and history are the only ones that actually need this data. So how do we actually make this work? Let's just focus on the sign-in component. The sign-in component we know is the entry point that gets that user data. How do we get this user data to the correct two nodes? Imagine that we just had these two red nodes that needs this. Wouldn't it be great if there was some way where we could actually create some kind of storage place where we could access it anywhere we want? We wouldn't have to drill through props or anything like that. So let's say we signed in with our user, and what we wanted to do is just store this user data from the sign-in into this kind of external storage place. And then once the user data is there, it can just directly pass it over to the corresponding nodes that needs it. No need for any of this prop drilling. Well, this is actually exactly what React Context allows us to do. It allows us to store our data somewhere so that we don't have to go through this cumbersome process of passing all of the relevant data we get down from some kind of child all the way up to some common ancestor, and then from that ancestor prop drill down to all of the relevant and necessary child components or grandchild components or grand-grandchild components that actually need this. Instead, what we can do is just take that sign-in, pass that data up to some external storage placement, and then anyone that needs it can access it from their corresponding place in the actual tree directly from this storage. This is context. So this is what we're going to learn in the next lesson. We're going to learn how to leverage this context in order to both store the user data and also access it later. So let's do that in the next video.